The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent. Across the scarred land of America, smoke still rose from battlefields where brothers had once stood on opposite sides of history. And through the ruins of the South, a new sound began to echo, the footsteps of the newly freed. Men, women, and children, walking barefoot on dusty roads, carrying nothing but faith and the hope that freedom would mean a new beginning. But freedom was fragile, and the dawn was darker than it seemed. Before we begin this journey through America's unfinished promise, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Join us as we uncover the hidden chapters of a nation still learning what freedom truly means. When the war ended in 1865, the chains of slavery were broken. But the scars it left behind ran deep. 4 million people stepped out of bondage and into uncertainty. The fields they once tilled now lay quiet. The masters were gone, but so were the homes, the work, and the security that had bound their lives in cruel captivity. They wandered the South, searching for family, for land, for belonging. For some, the first act of freedom was simply walking toward a horizon they had never been allowed to reach. Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a future where the Union would heal and the freedmen would rise as citizens, not victims. But his dream was cut short on an April night in Ford's Theater. The echo of that single gunshot changed the course of Reconstruction forever. In Lincoln's place stood Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat with little interest in racial equality and less courage to defend it. Under Johnson's weak hand, the South began to rebuild itself, not in the image of freedom, but of survival. Survival of the old order. Former Confederate leaders were pardoned. Black codes spread across Southern states, restricting movement, labor, and basic rights of the freedmen. The promise of emancipation began to look like a cruel mirage. Yet, in those early years, hope was not dead. Congress fought back against Johnson's leniency, passing laws that would reshape the Constitution itself. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection. The 15th gave the right to vote, at least in words, to every man regardless of race. On paper, America had taken a giant leap toward equality. In practice, the fight had just begun. In 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was created, a lifeline for millions. Its agents set up schools where children who had never held a book could finally learn to read. They helped families reclaim land, settle disputes, and build new communities. Churches became the first institutions truly their own, rising as sanctuaries of both faith and freedom. For the first time in American history, black men entered government. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black senator. Dozens of others took seats in state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. Their speeches echoed in halls that had once defended slavery. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the nation might truly redefine itself. But with progress came fury. In the shadows of the South, a new terror was born: the Ku Klux Klan. Hooded men rode at night, carrying torches and ropes, determined to restore white dominance by fear. Freedmen were dragged from their homes, teachers were lynched, and entire families fled in terror. The Klan's message was clear: the war was over, but their rule was not. Despite federal attempts to crush the violence, local authorities often turned a blind eye. Voter intimidation spread like wildfire. Polling stations burned, ballots destroyed, and men beaten for daring to cast a vote. What had begun as a moment of rebirth was slowly being strangled by hate and apathy. Still, resilience burned quietly. Communities built schools, printed newspapers, and preached the gospel of self-determination. Freedmen and their allies fought court battles, ran for office, and demanded that America live up to its own words. For a decade, against all odds, Reconstruction held, fragile, imperfect, but alive. Then came 1877, the year the dream collapsed. A disputed presidential election led to a backroom deal, the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the presidency, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. It was the final betrayal. The soldiers who had protected black voters and upheld Reconstruction packed their bags and left. And when the last troops marched away, the South fell back into darkness. White supremacy returned not with rebellion, but with law. The progress of 12 years was dismantled piece by piece. Schools were segregated. Voting rights were stripped away. Lynch mobs replaced justice. The promise of equality faded into memory. For the freedmen who had once walked barefoot toward freedom, the path now led into shadow once again. They had been citizens for a moment in history, long enough to taste what could have been before it was taken away. Yet, even in defeat, they carried something that could not be erased, the memory of what freedom had felt like. They had built communities, churches, and families that would endure. They had seen their own representatives in government. They had dreamed of equality. And dreams have a way of surviving even the darkest nights. The era of Reconstruction ended not with gunfire, but with silence. The silence of abandoned promises and forgotten graves. But from that silence, voices would rise again. The next generation would inherit both the pain and the purpose of those who refused to surrender. The story of America's freedom had not ended. It had only changed its disguise. The chains had been broken, yes, but new ones were already being forged. When the federal troops left the South in 1877, the air was heavy with quiet dread. The flags of Reconstruction were folded away, the schoolhouses emptied, and the dream of racial equality slipped into shadow. What followed was not peace, but a new war, fought not with muskets or cannons, but with laws, fear, and silence. Freedom, once promised, was redefined. And slavery, though abolished, found new forms. Across the South, the men who had once lost the Civil War began to rebuild their world. They called it redemption. But for millions of African Americans, it was nothing less than a second enslavement. Freedmen who had voted, held office, and owned land were now stripped of power by violence and deception. The Redeemer governments of the South rewrote state constitutions to restore white control, cloaking their cruelty in legality. The Jim Crow era was born, a system so vast, so calculated that it would define American life for generations. Named after a cruel minstrel caricature, Jim Crow became the law of the land, dictating where black men and women could live, eat, learn, travel, and even breathe. The promise of equality under the Constitution was twisted into the lie of separate but equal. This lie would be sanctified in 1896 in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, had dared to sit in a whites-only train car in Louisiana. For that act, he was arrested. And when his case reached the highest court in the nation, the justices ruled that segregation was not unconstitutional. The decision echoed across America like a verdict on freedom itself. Separate but equal became a cruel mantra used to justify two Americas, one of privilege, one of pain. Black schools received hand-me-down books and crumbling walls. Train cars were divided, restrooms labeled, water fountains marked white and colored. Even death could not bridge the divide. Cemeteries, too, were segregated. But the injustice went far beyond signs and symbols. In the fields and factories of the South, new chains were forged in the form of sharecropping and convict leasing. Sharecropping promised independence, but delivered poverty. Landless farmers worked the plantations of their former masters, paying rent with the crops they grew. Year after year, debt chained them to the same soil, trapped in a cycle that mimicked the very slavery they had escaped. The cotton they picked no longer belonged to an owner, but the system ensured they remained just as powerless. And then there was the convict lease system, perhaps the cruelest invention of all. States arrested black men by the thousands for petty or invented crimes, vagrancy, loitering, speaking too loudly to a white person. Once imprisoned, they were leased out to private companies, forced to work in mines, railroads, and factories under conditions worse than slavery. Whipped, starved, and left to die, they became the invisible labor that built the modern South. It was slavery reborn, hidden behind the mask of law, and when laws failed to keep order, terror filled the gaps. The lynching era began. Across the South, mobs gathered in the night, and sometimes in broad daylight, to enact their own brutal justice. Men were hanged from trees, burned alive, or shot before cheering crowds. Souvenirs were taken from the bodies. Photographs were printed as postcards. Between 1880 and 1900, thousands of African Americans were murdered without trial, their deaths celebrated as spectacles of white supremacy. The message was unmistakable. Equality would not be tolerated. Yet, through the horror, life continued. In small towns and cities, African Americans carved out spaces of resilience. They built churches, which became not only places of worship, but centers of strength and strategy. They formed mutual aid societies, offering help when the government would not. They opened schools, sometimes in barns or behind churches, where children learned by candlelight. Education became the quiet rebellion, the belief that knowledge could free the mind, even when the body was bound by law. In the North, the silence was deafening. Many Americans looked away, unwilling to confront what freedom truly meant. The newspapers wrote little of the South's atrocities, and the federal government, weary of racial conflict, chose political peace over moral justice. The nation that had fought a war to end slavery now tolerated its return in another form. Still, not all bowed to despair. Journalists and activists began to speak out. Ida B. Wells, a young black woman from Mississippi, risked her life to expose the horror of lynching. Her words cut through the nation's conscience. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. She was threatened, her presses destroyed, her life hunted. Yet, she continued to write, giving voice to the voiceless. For most, survival was an act of defiance. Families endured, worked, prayed, and taught their children to dream of something better. The strength of the black community lay not in its freedom, but in its faith that the struggle was not in vain, that dignity was worth fighting for even in the face of hate. The late 19th century became a time of deep contradiction. The United States was rising as an industrial power, preaching liberty to the world while denying it to millions at home. Cities grew, railroads expanded, and wealth filled the North. But in the South, poverty and fear remained the currency of control. The culture of white supremacy seeped into every corner of American life. From newspapers to school books, from stage plays to science. Pseudo-scientific racism declared African Americans inferior by nature, and popular entertainment mocked them in minstrel shows that spread the caricature of the lazy, foolish Negro. But behind those lies, truth endured in quiet places, in songs sung in fields, in sermons whispered from pulpits, in children's laughter echoing from the steps of one-room schoolhouses. Every act of survival was a statement. We are still here. By the turn of the century, a new generation was rising, one born not in slavery, but in struggle. They would soon carry the torch into the next chapter of the fight. The seeds of future leaders, teachers, activists, artists, were being planted in the soil of Jim Crow's cruelty. America entered the 20th century divided by color lines, but united by contradiction. The world saw a nation of freedom. Within its borders lived a people still bound by law and fear. The Constitution promised equality, yet the streets told another story. And still, Beneath the oppression, something was stirring. A longing for migration, a hunger for change. In the decades to come, millions would begin to move, leaving behind the cotton fields and broken promises of the South. They would travel north, chasing freedom once more, carrying with them faith, pain, and the unyielding will to rise. The journey was far from over. By the dawn of the 20th century, the South had become a place of quiet despair. The laws of Jim Crow ruled every corner of life, and for millions of African Americans, hope felt like a memory. The soil that once promised freedom now whispered only poverty and fear. But in the distance, beyond the cotton fields, beyond the whip of humiliation, a rumor began to spread. There was talk of cities far away, of factories with steady pay, of streets paved with opportunity, of a North where a man could walk with dignity. And so began one of the greatest movements of people in American history, the Great Migration. Between 1900 and 1930, more than 1 million African Americans packed what little they owned and boarded trains heading north to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. They left under the cover of night, often without telling their white employers, fearful of retribution. Some carried food wrapped in newspaper. Others clutched faded photographs of family left behind. The trains were crowded, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. For many, it was their first time leaving the South, their first time believing they could control their own destiny. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers stared out the windows as the landscape rolled by, fields turning into forests, forests into cities, and the cities into symbols of a new beginning. At the end of the line, freedom awaited, but not the freedom they had dreamed of. In the North, signs of segregation were not painted on walls, but they were carved into hearts. Landlords refused to rent to black families, forcing them into cramped neighborhoods. Employers paid less for the same labor. White workers, fearing competition, formed unions that excluded them, and yet, despite the prejudice, something extraordinary began to take root. Within the crowded streets of Chicago's South Side and Harlem in New York City, a new culture was being born, one that celebrated survival, pride, and creativity. The rhythm of jazz floated from clubs late into the night. Poets and painters told stories of both struggle and strength. Out of the pain of Jim Crow came a voice unlike anything America had ever heard before. This was the Harlem Renaissance, a rebirth of black identity through art, music, and words. In smoke-filled clubs, legends like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong turned sorrow into sound. In libraries and cafes, writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston painted portraits of a people rediscovering themselves. Their message was clear: we are not your shadow. We are your equal. But art was only one part of the movement. Politics and protest began to stir as well. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NEACP, was founded by a coalition of black and white activists, determined to challenge racial injustice through the courts and the press. Its leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, a scholar and visionary, believed that progress required intellect, organization, and courage. Du Bois famously declared that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. His words became a rallying cry for a generation unwilling to live in silence. In the same period, black newspapers emerged across the country. The Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and Baltimore Afro-American. They became lifelines of truth, exposing the violence of the South and encouraging migration northward. Each headline carried not just news, but hope. If you've been moved by these stories, the courage, the resilience, the fight for dignity, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. It's free, and it helps us keep bringing history's untold voices to light. Still, the North was no promised land. Prejudice followed wherever black families went. When jobs were scarce, they were the first to be fired. When housing was tight, they were crowded into ghettos. The promise of equality remained distant, and yet they endured, because endurance had always been their greatest weapon. In 1917, the nation was tested again, this time by World War I. Black men enlisted by the thousands, fighting under the American flag for a country that still denied them full citizenship. They fought bravely in Europe, believing that their service would earn respect at home. But when the war ended and they returned, they found the same hate waiting for them. The summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer, not for revolution, but for blood. Racial riots erupted across the country, from Chicago to Washington, D.C. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods, furious at the sight of returning soldiers who had learned to stand tall. Entire communities were burned to the ground. Yet even as violence spread, something else grew stronger: resistance. In churches and union halls, African Americans began organizing for their rights. Labor leaders, writers, and preachers demanded justice. The cry for equality, once a whisper, was becoming a chorus. Migration had done more than move people. It had transformed consciousness. In the North, black communities found new allies, new platforms, and new confidence. They built newspapers, theaters, and political groups. They learned that unity could be power. The Harlem Renaissance became more than an artistic movement. It was a statement of existence. It declared to the world that the descendants of slaves were not broken, not defeated, but alive with creativity, intellect, and spirit. Every poem, every jazz note, every painting was a protest, a declaration that beauty itself could be a weapon against hate. But the struggle was far from over. The 1920s brought prosperity for some, but not for all. The stock market roared, the cities gleamed, and the rich grew richer. For most black Americans, the promise of economic equality remained out of reach. The Great Migration continued, driven not just by hope, but by necessity. By 1930, more than 1.5 million African Americans had left the South. They built lives in the steel mills of Chicago, the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of Philadelphia. They brought with them the faith of their ancestors, the rhythm of their songs, and the memory of the land they had left behind. And though racism still shadowed their every step, they had changed the face of the nation forever. The Great Migration was not just a movement of bodies. It was a movement of the American soul. They had left the land of their oppression and planted the seeds of a future where their children might finally walk in true freedom. But even as hope bloomed in the north, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The world was about to change again. A Great Depression would sweep across America, testing the strength of all who had struggled to rise. In that storm, new leaders would emerge, new voices would be heard, and the dream of equality would once again be challenged. The decade began with silence, the kind that follows collapse. In 1929, the American dream shattered overnight. The Great Depression swept across the nation like a cold wind, and for millions, hope turned to hunger. Factories closed, banks failed, and men once proud of their work stood in breadlines that stretched for blocks. But for Black Americans, the Depression wasn't new. It was simply deeper. Poverty had always been their companion, discrimination their constant shadow. Now, the nation that had ignored their struggle was beginning to feel the pain they had endured for generations. In cities like Chicago, Harlem, and Detroit, unemployment among African Americans soared above 50%. They were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. Relief programs often turned them away, and charities divided their food lines by color. Families that had fled the cotton fields now found themselves trapped once again, this time in concrete jungles of despair. Still, out of the hardship, strength began to grow. When the world turned its back, the black community turned inward, finding unity in struggle. Churches became lifelines once more, offering meals, hope, and a sense of belonging. Ministers preached not just salvation, but survival. Across the nation, the New Deal arrived. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's ambitious promise to lift America from despair. To some, it was a beacon of hope. To others, a reminder that equality was still an afterthought. The New Deal's programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Act, changed the face of the country. But for African Americans, those promises came with limits. Southern politicians ensured that domestic workers and farm laborers, the very backbone of black labor, were excluded from many benefits. Federal programs were filtered through local governments steeped in segregation. Even the alphabet agencies reflected the nation's color line. In work camps, white and black laborers were housed separately. In schools and hospitals built with federal funds, the signs of Jim Crow still hung over the doors. And yet, something was shifting. For the first time, the federal government's presence reached deep into the lives of the poor, black and white alike. With it came new political awareness. For decades, African Americans had supported the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But by the late 1930s, the tide began to turn. Roosevelt's willingness to listen, however imperfectly, sparked a transformation. The black vote, once loyal to the Party of Emancipation, began to drift toward the Democrats, reshaping American politics for generations to come. But political change was only part of the story. In the heart of the Depression, new voices of defiance began to rise. One of the most powerful belonged to A. Philip Randolph, a labor leader with a calm voice and unshakable resolve. He organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first major black labor union in the United States. Randolph's fight was not only for fair wages, but for dignity, for the right to be seen as equal men in a nation that still refused to see. His message spread far beyond the railways. He challenged both government and industry, declaring that the struggle for workers' rights and civil rights were one and the same. Freedom, he said, is never given. It is won. At the same time, a quiet revolution of art and consciousness continued to grow. The spirit of the Harlem Renaissance had not faded. It had deepened. Painters, poets, and musicians began to look inward, drawing from the hardship of the Depression to tell the truth about black life in America. Writers like Richard Wright used words as weapons. His novels exposed the raw reality of racism and poverty, forcing readers to confront what America wanted to forget. Through his work, and through countless others, a new generation of black voices refused to remain silent. In the South, the NAACP fought legal battles against segregation and lynching. Its lawyers and activists risked their lives to challenge the laws of Jim Crow, often with little more than faith and determination as their defense. Each court victory, no matter how small, became a spark of light in the darkness. And in the pulpits, the music halls, and the classrooms, those sparks began to connect. The black church, the oldest institution of freedom, once again became the beating heart of resistance. Sermons echoed with messages of equality, not just in heaven, but on earth. Choirs sang spirituals that carried both sorrow and defiance. We shall overcome. Someday. The Depression had broken America's economy, but it had also stripped away illusions. The myth that hard work alone guaranteed success was gone, and in its place, a new understanding was born. That freedom meant more than survival. It meant justice. By the late 1930s, the world was changing once again. Across the ocean, fascism was rising in Europe. Nations prepared for war. America spoke of defending democracy, of standing against tyranny and oppression. But in the streets of Birmingham, in the cotton fields of Mississippi, In the alleys of Harlem, millions of Americans still lived under tyranny at home. As the drums of war began to beat, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could a nation fight for liberty abroad while denying it to its own citizens? That question would ignite the next great movement of American history. And though few could see it then, the seeds of the civil rights movement were already in the soil. They grew quietly in union halls, in classrooms, in church pews, in the hearts of young men and women who refused to accept inequality as destiny. They grew in the courage of journalists who exposed injustice, in the determination of mothers who sent their children to segregated schools, believing education was still worth the risk. They grew in the quiet prayers of millions who had survived the lash, the law, and the lie, still believing that one day the words of the Constitution would finally include them. As the 1940s dawned, America stood on the edge of war. A war that would reshape not just the world, but its own soul. Black soldiers would march again, this time under a flag that still denied them full equality. They would fight tyranny overseas while dreaming of freedom at home. And when they returned, they would demand it. Because by then, the world would have changed, and so would they. The fight for civil rights was no longer a distant dream. It was a gathering storm. The decades of oppression, migration, and resistance had built the foundation for something unstoppable. A movement that would soon challenge the very core of American democracy. The shadows of Reconstruction were long, but they could not last forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, where freedom's promise is betrayed, and a new system of oppression rises from the ashes. The year is 1941. The world is on fire. Nazi tanks roll across Europe. Japanese bombers thunder over the Pacific. And America stands on the brink of war. A war for freedom, for democracy, for the dignity of man. But as the drums of battle echo overseas, another battle is quietly burning at home. A battle not fought with guns or planes, but with the raw courage of a people who have tasted injustice for far too long. For millions of Black Americans, this war will not just be against Hitler, it will be against hypocrisy itself. You're watching the Civil Rights Movement series, where we uncover how a nation built on liberty learned to live up to its own promise. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the story of how freedom finally found its voice. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, America entered World War II with a cry for justice and victory. Yet for many, those words rang hollow. In the segregated South, signs still hung above water fountains, white and colored. Schools were separate, jobs were scarce, and lynching was not a memory. It was a threat. But something shifted when the war began. Black men and women, long denied equality, saw a new opportunity, a chance to prove their loyalty, their courage, and their right to belong in the very nation that had kept them apart. Across America, recruitment offices filled with young Black men eager to serve. They wanted to wear the uniform, to fight tyranny, to show the world that freedom was not the privilege of one color. In Pittsburgh, the Courier newspaper launched a campaign that captured this new spirit. Its name, the Double V, Victory Abroad Against Fascism and Victory at Home Against Racism. It was a simple, electrifying idea. The Double V campaign became a rallying cry across the nation. In barbershops, churches, and city streets, it spoke to something deep. The yearning to be treated not as outsiders, but as Americans. Yet, even in uniform, segregation followed. In the military, Black soldiers were placed in separate units, often commanded by white officers who doubted their ability. Many were assigned to menial labor, loading cargo, cleaning, cooking, while their white counterparts fought on the front lines. But history would soon prove them wrong. The Tuskegee Airmen, A group of black pilots trained in Alabama shattered every stereotype. Flying dangerous escort missions over Europe, they protected white bomber crews with unmatched precision. Their planes were marked with red tails, and soon, red tails became a name whispered with respect across Allied skies. In the Pacific, black soldiers stormed beaches and manned ships, enduring the same hellfire as everyone else. In Europe, they marched through snow and blood, pushing back the Nazi machine. They fought for a freedom they still didn't fully possess. And when victory was declared in 1945, they came home expecting gratitude and change. But the America that greeted them was still divided by color lines. In Georgia, a decorated veteran named Isaac Woodard, still wearing his uniform, was beaten and blinded by police after returning from war. The message was clear. The old order had not disappeared. Still, something had changed in those who served. The soldiers who had faced Hitler's armies refused to bow again. To Jim Crow, they had seen a world where race did not define a man's worth, and they brought that vision home with them. Their courage became fuel for a new era. Churches began to hum with talk of protest. Newspapers carried stories not just of injustice, but of defiance. A generation of veterans, disciplined, proud, and fearless, would soon take their fight from the battlefield to the streets of America. The war had ended, but for millions of black Americans, the battle for freedom was just beginning. Because when you've fought tyranny abroad, how do you accept it at home? The post-war years were a strange contradiction. The United States emerged as a global power, preaching democracy to the world. Yet, in the South, poll taxes still silenced voters, and lynch mobs still ruled by fear. The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore, and the world was watching. Soviet propaganda began to use America's racial injustice as a weapon, calling out the irony of a free world built on segregation. Under this international pressure, and with the growing unrest of black citizens, the White House could no longer look away. President Harry Truman took a bold step. In 1948, he issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. For the first time, the military, the institution that had excluded so many, began to reflect the ideals it claimed to defend. It was a symbolic act, but a powerful one. For black veterans, it felt like a promise that the fight they had begun overseas might, at last, continue at home. Beyond the halls of government, change was stirring in the streets. New organizations, young leaders, and community networks began challenging the old order. The NEACP gained strength, filing lawsuits against school segregation and discriminatory practices. Each case chipped away at the legal foundation of Jim Crow. Meanwhile, black newspapers and radio stations carried voices of defiance, spreading stories of hope and courage to millions. The message was clear. The time of quiet endurance was over. In the heart of Harlem, in the factories of Detroit, in the fields of Mississippi, a new identity was being born. The war had shown that unity could defeat empires. Now, that same unity would be turned inward, to confront America's own empire of prejudice. The church became a fortress of organization and faith. Ministers preached not only salvation, but equality. And the veterans, men hardened by war, stood ready to defend their dignity in a different kind of battle. By the early 1950s, the air was thick with possibility. The system that once seemed unbreakable had begun to crack. But before freedom could rise, tragedy and courage would collide once more. In courtrooms, classrooms, and eventually, on a quiet bus in Montgomery. The story of the civil rights movement was now gathering force, built on the dreams of soldiers who refused to be forgotten, and on the determination of a people who had learned, through war and pain, that freedom must be fought for everywhere, or it means nothing anywhere. The color line was trembling, and soon it would break. The war had ended. The victory parades faded. But for millions of Black Americans, the peace that followed was uneasy and hollow. They had fought to destroy fascism, yet returned to find segregation still alive, standing tall and unashamed. White-only schools, white-only restaurants, white-only futures. The contradiction was unbearable, and slowly, across the nation, a question began to rise. If America could defeat tyranny abroad, why couldn't it defeat injustice at home? The 1940s would become a decade of awakening. Not yet a revolution, but a restlessness. A time when ordinary men and women decided that silence was no longer an option. In those years, the NAACP, once a small group of lawyers, scholars, and churchmen, began to grow into a force of history. Its legal team, led by a young attorney named Thurgood Marshall, developed a bold strategy. If segregation could not be toppled through politics, it would be dismantled piece by piece through the courts. Their battleground was the law, their weapon, the Constitution itself. Every case they filed struck at the heart of the separate but equal doctrine that had shackled Black America since Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. They started small, challenging unequal teacher salaries, segregated graduate schools, and exclusion from juries. But each victory sent a ripple through the system. Each ruling was a crack in the legal armor of Jim Crow. Outside the courtroom, a quieter revolution was stirring. Across the country, Black veterans, men who had fought shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, returned home unwilling to be treated as second-class citizens. In the South, they tried to register to vote, to buy land, to demand respect. And for this, many paid a heavy price. Some were threatened, some were beaten, some disappeared. But they did not back down. For every act of violence meant to silence them, another voice rose to take their place. From the fields of Mississippi to the factories of Detroit, a new determination was spreading, one rooted not in fear, but in faith. The world was changing, but the South still clung to the past, and soon those two worlds would collide, in the courts, in the streets, and in the conscience of a nation. In 1947, a small group of Black and white activists, calling themselves the Congress of Racial Equality, CEI, launched a daring protest they called the Journey of Reconciliation. They boarded buses across the Upper South, sitting together in defiance of segregation laws. It was a quiet act, yet explosive in meaning, the forerunner of what the world would later know as the Freedom Rides. They were arrested, threatened, mocked, but the idea had taken root. Change would not come by waiting. It would come by walking forward. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Harry S. Truman, shaken by the brutal beating of Black veterans and alarmed by America's growing reputation for hypocrisy, made a choice that shocked his own party. In 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, ordering the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. It was a turning point. For the first time, the government officially challenged the color line, not in words, but in action. Truman's decision was not purely moral. It was also strategic. The Cold War had begun, and the United States was desperate to present itself as the world's beacon of democracy. How could it claim moral superiority over the Soviet Union while still lynching its own citizens? Yet, whatever his motive, Truman's order gave courage to millions. If the president could act, maybe others could too. Across Black America, the sense of isolation began to fade. New organizations formed, church groups, youth councils, neighborhood committees, small circles of resistance that would soon grow into a movement. In Mississippi, teacher and activist Fannie Lou Hamer began organizing voter registration drives. In Louisiana, A. Philip Randolph, the same man who had threatened to march on Washington during the war, founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. the first black labor union to win a major contract. They fought not with guns, but with dignity, boycotting, petitioning, and demanding the rights they had earned 100 years earlier in name, but not in reality. Yet for every victory, the backlash grew sharper. Southern politicians began crafting new laws to protect segregation. They called it states' rights, but its purpose was clear: to preserve white supremacy by any legal means. White citizens' councils emerged, dressed in suits instead of hoods, but preaching the same message the Klan had carried for decades. Keep the races apart. Keep the order intact. The tension was rising, and everyone could feel it. The legal victories of the NAACP and the small protests across the country were beginning to converge, like streams joining into a river. Something larger was forming, something unstoppable. By the early 1950s, that river began to flow toward one single destination: the fight for education. If black children could learn beside white children, the walls of segregation would crumble from the inside. And so began the most important legal battle of the century: Brown versus Board of Education. But before that historic decision, the movement needed strength. It needed faith. It needed people willing to stand, even when standing meant danger. That strength came from the black church. It was more than a place of worship. It was a fortress of hope, a network of organization, and a voice for those who had none. Every Sunday sermon became a lesson in courage. Every hymn, a quiet promise that freedom was coming. The stage was now set. Thurgood Marshall's legal battles had drawn blood from the system. Truman's order had cracked its armor. The people, inspired by veterans, faith, and principle, were ready to rise. The South stood defiant, determined to hold its ground. But the tide of history was shifting, inch by inch, case by case. A new generation of Americans was awakening, one that refused to accept the old lies of inferiority. They had seen the world at war. They had seen the price of silence. Now they were ready to speak, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and soon in the streets. The color line had been challenged, and in the next chapter, it would be tested, in a courtroom that would forever change America's conscience. The year was 1951, and in Topeka, Kansas, a small, quiet city surrounded by endless plains, a young girl named Linda Brown walked through the cold morning air toward her school. Her journey was not long in distance, but heavy in meaning, because every day she had to pass by a perfectly good white school near her home, and instead travel across town, through railway yards and busy streets, to a run-down building reserved for black children. To the world, it looked like routine. To her parents, it was injustice. And so began one of the most important legal battles in American history: Brown versus Board of Education. By the early 1950s, segregation had become more than a policy. It was a belief system, reinforced by generations who accepted separate but equal as gospel. But equal was a lie. Black schools were underfunded, overcrowded, and neglected. Teachers worked without supplies. Students learned from outdated books discarded by white schools. The NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, decided it was time to strike at the very heart of the system. Not by demanding better black schools, but by demanding equality itself. Their argument was simple but revolutionary. Segregation, by its very nature, created inequality. It made one group feel inferior and another feel superior. And that violated the Constitution's promise of equal protection under the law. Marshall and his team gathered cases from 5 states: Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., and combined them into one. Together, they would challenge not a single policy, but the entire legal foundation of segregation in America. The courtroom became a battlefield of ideas. The opposing side argued that segregation was tradition, that the South's way of life depended on it. They claimed that separate schools did not harm anyone, that people were simply happier apart. But Marshall's team came armed not only with legal logic, but with science. They presented studies showing how segregation damaged the minds of children, how black children, forced to attend separate schools, often felt shame and worthlessness because of the color of their skin. One famous experiment, known as the doll test, revealed the painful truth. When given a choice between a white doll and a black doll, many black children said the white doll was good and the black one was bad. When asked which doll looked like them, they hesitated, then pointed to the bad one. It was heartbreaking evidence, proof that segregation wasn't just social policy. It was psychological warfare. This was no longer about schools. It was about the soul of America. Could a nation that preached equality still teach inequality to its children? The case reached the Supreme Court in 1952. For 2 years, the justices debated, argued, and postponed. The nation held its breath. The South threatened revolt if segregation were overturned. Some politicians warned that integration would destroy the social order. But in 1954, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court made its decision, unanimous and clear. In the field of public education, the court declared, "The doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." With those words, Brown v. Board of Education shattered nearly 60 years of legalized segregation. The decision sent shockwaves across the country, in the streets of Harlem, in churches across the South, in classrooms from Kansas to Carolina. People wept, cheered, and prayed. It was more than a legal victory. It was a moral awakening. For the first time, the highest court in the land had recognized what Black Americans had always known: that equality delayed is equality denied. But the celebration did not last long. In the South, the reaction was swift and furious. White politicians denounced the decision as a federal assault on states' rights. Governors vowed defiance. Newspapers warned of racial chaos. Some communities even closed public schools rather than integrate them. Across Dixie, a campaign of resistance was born. They called it massive resistance. Citizens' councils sprang up overnight. Formal, well-funded groups dedicated to preserving segregation through intimidation and legislation. Teachers who supported integration were fired. Black families who challenged the system faced violence and economic ruin. And the Ku Klux Klan, though quieter than before, began to rise again in the shadows. The Supreme Court had spoken, but without enforcement, its words hung in the air like a promise unkept. Southern states stalled. Court orders were ignored. The ruling declared that integration should proceed with all deliberate speed, and segregationists used those words to delay change indefinitely. Still, change had begun, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. In some cities, like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, schools began to integrate peacefully. In others, the path was harder, but the seed had been planted. The children who walked into those newly integrated schools were not just students. They were pioneers. Their courage would soon inspire a movement far greater than anyone could have imagined. Beyond the courtrooms and classrooms, a deeper transformation was stirring. The victory in Brown v. Board gave hope to millions. It told them that the law could be a weapon for justice, that the system could, under pressure, bend toward what was right. The decision emboldened ministers, teachers, parents, and students to stand taller, to organize, to believe that the fight could be won. For the first time since Reconstruction, the dream of equality no longer felt distant. It felt possible. Yet history rarely moves without pain. And in the summer of 1955, just 1 year after Brown v. Board, that hope was tested by an act of unimaginable cruelty. A 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till left Chicago to visit relatives in Mississippi and never came home. His lynching, brutal, senseless, and public, would expose the raw violence still pulsing beneath the surface of Southern life. And when his mother decided to show the world what had been done to her son, America would no longer be able to look away. Brown versus Board of Education cracked the wall of segregation, but it also revealed how deep the roots of hatred ran. In the court, equality had won. In the streets, the battle was just beginning. It was the summer of 1955, hot, heavy, and slow in the small town of Money, Mississippi. A 14-year-old boy from Chicago named Emmett Till arrived to visit his relatives. He was curious, playful, and a little bold. A city boy trying to understand the quiet world of the South. He didn't yet know that in Mississippi, every glance, every word, every smile had invisible boundaries, and crossing those boundaries could mean death. One afternoon, Emmett walked into a small grocery store to buy candy. Inside was a young white woman, Carolyn Bryant. What happened next is still debated. Some said he whistled, others said he only smiled. But in 1955 Mississippi, that was enough. Days later, in the dead of night, armed men broke into the home of Emmett's great-uncle. They dragged the boy out of bed at gunpoint. His family pleaded, screamed, begged, but he was taken away into the darkness. 3 days later, his body was found in the Tallahatchie River. Beaten beyond recognition, weighted down with a cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. When Emmett's body was returned to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, made a decision that would change history. She demanded an open casket funeral. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her son. Tens of thousands filed past his coffin. Jet magazine published the photos. America, for the first time, saw the face of Southern racism, unfiltered and undeniable. The image of Emmett's mutilated body pierced the national conscience. It was a wound that could not be unseen. Emmett Till's death was more than a tragedy. It was a revelation. The world now knew that segregation wasn't just unfair, it was deadly. In Mississippi, the men accused of killing Emmett Till stood trial. The courtroom was packed. White men on the jury, white officials presiding, white spectators jeering. After barely an hour of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. The killers walked free, and later bragged about their crime to a national magazine, knowing they could never be tried again. For generations, black families had lived in fear of such injustice. But this time, something was different. This time, the anger didn't fade. It spread across towns, churches, and hearts. From that moment on, the movement was no longer a dream of the few. It became the mission of the many. As the shock of Emmett Till's murder still lingered, another story began. This time, not in the cotton fields of Mississippi, but in the city buses of Montgomery, Alabama. In December 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a bus after a long day's work. She sat in the section reserved for black passengers, the middle, where the lines of segregation were literally drawn by the driver's whim. When a white man boarded and the seats filled up, the driver ordered her to move. Rosa looked up, calm, tired, and unyielding, and simply said, "No." It was a word so small, yet so powerful, that it echoed through generations. Her arrest sparked a fire that had been waiting to burn. Within days, Montgomery's black community, led by local ministers, students, and laborers, came together to fight back. Not with violence, but with absence. They would stop riding the buses. The Montgomery Bus Boycott began in December 1955. Carpools were organized. Churches turned into planning centers. For over a year, men and women walked miles to work under the southern sun and rain, refusing to fund their own humiliation. Their weapon was dignity. Their message was clear. We have walked long enough in the shadows. We will walk for freedom now. The boycott needed a leader, someone to speak with authority, but also compassion. That voice emerged from a young preacher newly arrived in town, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. King's words carried the rhythm of Scripture and the fire of revolution. He spoke of love, not hatred, of nonviolence, not vengeance. He told his people that they would win not by destroying their enemies, but by transforming them. Under his guidance, the boycott became more than a protest. It became a movement. Reporters came from across the country. The world watched as ordinary citizens stood against a system that had ruled them for centuries. And as they walked, day after day, month after month, their footsteps echoed louder than any speech. The city fought back. Leaders were arrested. Bombs exploded near churches and homes, but the walkers did not stop. Their resolve was stronger than fear. Finally, in November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The boycott had lasted 381 days, and it had won. When Rosa Parks and others returned to those buses, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing up for dignity, for justice, for a nation's conscience. By 1955's end, a new chapter in American history had begun. The murder of Emmett Till revealed the depth of racial cruelty. The courage of Rosa Parks and the unity of Montgomery revealed the power of peaceful resistance. And the voice of Martin Luther King, Jr. announced that a new kind of war had begun, not with weapons, but with words, marches, and the unstoppable force of truth. The civil rights movement was now alive, no longer hidden in courtrooms or whispered in churches, but marching in the open streets. A people once bound by fear were now guided by faith. And across America, the message was spreading. Change is coming. The lynching of Emmett Till had shown the darkness of hatred. The Montgomery Bus Boycott revealed the light of courage. Together, they marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The color line had not yet disappeared, but it had been broken by the cry of a child and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to move. The buses of Montgomery still rumbled through the Alabama streets, but something had changed. After decades of quiet submission, of whispers behind closed doors and bowed heads at bus stops, a quiet defiance was about to ignite a revolution. The year was 1955, and in the Deep South, segregation was not just law, it was a way of life. Black Americans were told where to sit, where to eat, where to live. The scars of slavery had been buried under new rules of humiliation, but beneath that heavy silence, there was movement, a heartbeat of resistance that refused to die. Then came Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress, exhausted after a long day of work. When the bus driver ordered her to stand for a white man, she quietly said, "No." That single word echoed through centuries of oppression, louder than any shout, stronger than any protest. Her arrest was meant to be routine, but that night, the community gathered, church leaders, teachers, laborers, mothers, fathers, and decided they'd had enough. They would no longer ride the buses of Montgomery until the system of segregation was broken. And so, on a cold December morning, thousands of black men and women began walking. Miles to work, miles to school, feet blistered, but spirits unbroken. This was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, a movement that would last 381 days and shake the very core of America's racial order. What began with one woman's act of courage would soon become a nationwide cry for justice. And from the heart of Montgomery, a new leader would rise. If you believe in stories that change the world, subscribe now and stay with us as we walk beside those who dared to dream of equality. Into this moment stepped a 26-year-old preacher named Martin Luther King, Jr. He was young, unknown, and reluctant at first, but his voice, calm, powerful, and filled with conviction, became the soul of a new movement. From the pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he preached not hatred, but love. Not vengeance, but nonviolence. He told his congregation that moral courage was stronger than any weapon. King drew inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi, who had used peaceful resistance to free India from colonial rule. To King, nonviolence was not weakness. It was power under control, guided by faith. His words spread like wildfire. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the God of justice is wrong. But the price of that faith was heavy. White extremists bombed King's home. His wife and newborn daughter barely escaped harm. Black families faced threats, arrests, and attacks. Yet the people of Montgomery refused to surrender. They organized carpool systems, shared rides, prayed together, and walked, day after day, month after month. The white establishment thought they would give up. But with every passing week, the boycott grew stronger. The city's buses ran nearly empty. The world began to take notice. Newspapers across the country printed photos of ordinary Americans walking through rain and heat, dressed in Sunday clothes, holding their heads high. And then, finally, in December 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down bus segregation as unconstitutional. The boycott had triumphed. Montgomery had changed, and so had America. But this victory was only the beginning, because once a people taste freedom, there's no turning back. The fire that started in Montgomery would soon spread to lunch counters, freedom rides, and the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. By 1957, King and other ministers formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, an organization that would carry the message of nonviolent protest across the South. Their goal was clear: to challenge segregation through moral confrontation and peaceful defiance. They faced constant arrests, beatings, and intimidation. Yet their movement was unlike anything the world had ever seen. No weapons, no armies, just ordinary people armed with faith, discipline, and hope. King's voice began to echo beyond the South. His speeches, filled with rhythm, scripture, and moral truth, awakened the conscience of a nation. But he wasn't alone. Across the country, a new generation of young Black Americans was growing restless. They had seen enough of patience and promises. They wanted change, now. In 1960, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to take that change into their own hands. They walked into a Woolworth's department store, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter, and ordered coffee. The waiter refused to serve them. They stayed, hour after hour, insult after insult. They didn't fight back. They simply sat, silently, peacefully, until they were dragged out. The next day, dozens more joined them. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Within weeks, sit-ins were happening across the South. The strategy was simple, but the impact was seismic. Young men and women were rewriting the rules of protest. Back in Montgomery, King watched the sit-ins unfold and realized the movement had entered a new phase. The fire he helped ignite was now being carried by the youth. Fearless, determined, and unwilling to wait. By the end of the decade, the civil rights movement was no longer a local struggle. It was a national awakening. Television cameras began capturing images of peaceful protesters facing brutality. The world was watching, and yet, through all the beatings, the bombings, and the hatred, the movement stayed rooted in King's vision. That love could conquer fear. That peace could defeat violence. That truth could break the chains of injustice. The first great battle had been won. The law had shifted. The spirit of a people had risen, and America had taken its first step toward redemption. But in the distance, the storm was still gathering. The next decade would bring both dream and fire. Marches, speeches, bombs, and bullets. because the path to freedom was never straight. It was carved by those who refused to sit down, even when the world told them to. The year was 1960, and the winds of change were sweeping through America. The victory in Montgomery had given Black Americans a new language, the language of courage, discipline, and dignity. But for a younger generation, patience had run out. They were not content to wait for justice to come someday. They wanted it now. 4 young college students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College decided to test the boundaries of segregation. On February 1, 1960, they walked into a Woolworth's department store in Greensboro, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter, and politely ordered coffee. The waitress refused to serve them. The manager demanded they leave. The young men didn't move. They just sat, silent, still, and unyielding. Outside, curious eyes watched. Inside, insults were hurled. A cup of coffee was poured down someone's back. But still, they sat. By the next day, more students joined them. By the end of the week, sit-ins had spread to Winston-Salem, Raleigh, and Nashville. By the end of the month, they had reached cities across the South. Newspapers called it a wave of rebellion. But to those who sat down, it was an act of freedom. They were fighting segregation not with fists or fire, but with patience and pride. A movement was being born. One led not by preachers or politicians, but by students. They didn't have power, wealth, or protection, but they had something stronger, the conviction that dignity could no longer be delayed. Out of this spirit rose a new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Its members were young, idealistic, and fearless. They met in churches and college halls, vowing to keep their protests peaceful, no matter what violence came their way. Their motto was simple: we want our freedom, and we want it now. In Nashville, students organized disciplined sit-ins, facing beatings, arrests, and humiliation with quiet resolve. They were spat on, kicked, dragged across floors, yet they refused to strike back. Among them was a young man named John Lewis, the son of Alabama sharecroppers, who would soon become one of the moral pillars of the movement. He later recalled, "We were just trying to redeem the soul of America." These students were not only challenging segregation, they were reshaping the meaning of resistance. Their courage was contagious. By 1961, the movement was ready to take its message beyond lunch counters. The Supreme Court had already ruled that segregation in interstate travel was illegal. But across the South, that law was ignored. So a small interracial group of activists, both black and white, decided to test it. They called themselves the Freedom Riders. They boarded 2 buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans, determined to ride through the heart of the Jim Crow South, sitting side by side, eating together, and defying the color line at every stop. The journey began peacefully, but as they crossed into Alabama, the South struck back. In Anniston, a mob surrounded one of the buses, smashed its windows, and set it on fire. As flames filled the air, riders tried to escape, only to be beaten by the mob waiting outside. In Birmingham, police looked the other way as white supremacists attacked the second bus with clubs and chains. Images of the burning buses and bloodied passengers flashed across the nation's newspapers. America could no longer pretend not to see. When the original group was forced to stop, new riders took their place. Young men and women from all over the country who refused to let fear win. They kept riding, city to city, through fists and flames. At every turn, they were arrested, jailed, beaten. But the freedom rides would not die. The violence grew so intense that the Kennedy administration was forced to intervene. Federal marshals were sent to protect the riders. For the first time in years, the federal government was being pulled into the moral battlefield of the South. One reporter wrote, "They may ride beaten, but they ride. They may ride bloody, but they ride. And they will keep riding until the nation sees its own reflection. And indeed, America was staring into the mirror. The question was no longer whether injustice existed, but how long the country could look at it and still do nothing. As the freedom rides continued, the civil rights movement began to fracture along lines of urgency. Martin Luther King Jr. still preached nonviolence and patience. He believed that hate could only be defeated by love. But others, especially the youth, began to wonder if love was enough. Some within SNCC argued that turning the other cheek only emboldened the oppressors. They saw their friends beaten, their buses burned, their rights mocked, and asked, "How much longer must we wait?" The movement was no longer just about laws, it was about identity, pride, and power. Still, King remained steadfast. He warned that anger, though justified, could destroy the soul of the cause. "Hate cannot drive out hate," he said. "Only love can do that." Those words, spoken in church basements and on courthouse steps, became the moral heartbeat of the movement. Meanwhile, the violence was escalating. Freedom riders were thrown into Mississippi's Parchman Penitentiary, one of the harshest prisons in the country. Guards tried to break their spirits by isolating them, forcing them to sing through the night just to keep hope alive. Yet that singing, those hymns, those chants, became a soundtrack of endurance. From "We Shall Overcome" to "This Little Light of Mine," music turned pain into power. The buses kept rolling. The riders kept coming. The system could no longer hold. By late 1961, the federal government finally ordered the end of segregation in all interstate travel facilities. The Freedom Riders had won, but their victory came with scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual. They had forced the nation to confront its hypocrisy, to face the truth it had long denied. In just 1 year, young men and women with no weapons, no money, and no protection had transformed the struggle for civil rights into a national movement. The sit-ins had shown that peace could shake an empire. The freedom rides had proven that courage could ride through fire and still emerge unbroken. But the South was far from surrendering. Even as the buses rolled freely, the deeper walls of racism remained. And in the years ahead, those walls would be tested again. In the streets of Birmingham, under the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, and on a bridge in Selma, where blood would stain the Alabama soil. By the early 1960s, the civil rights movement had marched through fear and fire. The sit-ins and freedom rides had shattered the silence of the South. And now, the nation stood at a crossroads. For many white Americans, segregation was beginning to look less like a way of life and more like a national shame. But for those living under its chains, change still felt like a dream deferred. 3 would test that dream like never before. It began in Birmingham, Alabama, a city so divided that Martin Luther King Jr. once called it the most thoroughly segregated city in America. Here, every park, restaurant, and restroom was marked by race. The local police commissioner, Eugene "Bull" Connor, was a symbol of white resistance, loud, proud, and brutal. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, saw Birmingham as the perfect battleground. If they could break segregation there, they could break it anywhere. So they came, ministers, students, and families, to challenge the city's unjust laws through peaceful protest. They marched, they sang, they prayed in the streets, and the police struck back. Connor unleashed fire hoses and attacked dogs on children. Television cameras captured the chaos. Young boys and girls slammed against walls by torrents of water, dragged across pavement by officers twice their size. America watched in horror. For years, the South had hidden its cruelty behind courtroom walls and closed doors. But now, The world was seeing it, the raw truth of segregation, burning through every living room screen. If you want to witness how these moments of pain turned into the dream that defined a generation, make sure to subscribe and stay with us through this powerful journey. As the violence raged, King was arrested and thrown into jail for leading the demonstrations. In that narrow, dark cell, armed only with scraps of paper and moral conviction, he wrote one of the most profound letters in American history. The letter from Birmingham jail. It was not a cry of anger, but of conscience. To those who told him to wait, King wrote, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." He reminded America that the greatest enemy of freedom was not the white supremacist with a hood, but the moderate who preferred order over justice. His words became a blueprint for the movement. Calm, reasoned, and yet burning with truth. Outside the jail, the protests continued. Thousands filled the streets, and even the youngest, school children, joined in. The courage of those children broke the stalemate. After weeks of confrontation, Birmingham's business leaders finally agreed to desegregate public facilities. But the price was high. Before the summer ended, white supremacists bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. Their innocent faces became symbols of the cost of hate. America was changing, but every step forward was written in pain. And yet, through the grief, the movement gathered strength. Out of Birmingham's fire came a moment that would lift the nation's soul. That moment arrived on August 28, 1963. On a bright summer morning, more than 250,000 people flooded the National Mall in Washington, D.C. They came by buses, trains, and caravans from Harlem and Chicago, from Atlanta and New Orleans, black and white, young and old. They gathered peacefully in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. It was the largest demonstration in American history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The mood was electric. The air carried songs of hope, chants of unity, and prayers for change. One by one, civil rights leaders took the stage. They spoke of dignity, work, and equality, of the simple human right to exist without fear. Then, at last, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium. The crowd fell silent. He began slowly, his voice steady, calling on America to make good on its founding promise that all men are created equal. But as he spoke, something changed. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And so he did. "I have a dream," he said, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." The words soared across the mall, over the reflecting pool, and into history. He dreamed of a day when his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He dreamed of justice rolling down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. For 17 minutes, the world stopped to listen. When King finished, there were tears in the crowd, tears of pride, pain, and faith. That day, the dream became more than a speech. It became a promise. News cameras broadcast the event around the globe. Even those who had resisted the movement could no longer deny its moral force. But for all its beauty, the March on Washington did not end the struggle. The dream was powerful, yes, but America was still divided. In the South, segregationists dug in deeper. Violence flared in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Churches were bombed, activists murdered. Still, hope endured. Because now, the world had seen what America could be, what it should be. King's words had awakened something deep within the national conscience. In the weeks after the march, President John F. Kennedy, who had long hesitated to act, began drafting sweeping civil rights legislation. But before it could pass, tragedy struck again. In November 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The dream seemed to falter, and yet, even in mourning, the movement pressed on. Because the dream was no longer one man's vision, it had become the voice of millions. Across churches, campuses, and city halls, people kept marching, kept organizing, kept believing. They had seen the light of justice once, and they refused to let it fade. The March on Washington marked the height of hope in the civil rights era. It united a divided people under the banner of freedom and faith. But the years ahead would test that unity. For in the South, the battle for the ballot, the right to vote, was only beginning. And the fire that burned in Birmingham would soon blaze again on a bridge in Selma, where peace would meet blood, and a nation would be forced to choose between its ideals and its fears. The dream had been spoken on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, words that echoed across a nation's conscience. But dreams, no matter how powerful, are tested in the light of reality. As 1964 dawned, America stood at a breaking point. The BTB marches, the speeches, the songs, they had shaken the walls of segregation. Yet hatred still lived in the cracks. And soon, those cracks would explode into fire. In the Deep South, the battle shifted from the buses and lunch counters to the ballot box. For nearly a century, Black Americans had been legally free, but they were still politically voiceless. Through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation, white officials had denied millions the right to vote. The movement knew that without the ballot, freedom was only a word. So they went south, students, activists, church leaders, and volunteers, to bring democracy where it had never been allowed to breathe. It became known as Freedom Summer. Hundreds of young people traveled to Mississippi, one of the most dangerous states for civil rights work. They taught in freedom schools, registered voters, and preached hope under the constant threat of violence. Within weeks, 3 activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Their bodies were found weeks later, buried in an earthen dam. They had been tortured and murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. The nation was horrified. But the South had sent its message. Change would not come without blood. And yet, even through terror, the movement did not break. It would rise higher, from the ashes of Mississippi to the halls of Congress itself. In July 1964, after months of fierce debate, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, one of the most transformative laws in American history. It outlawed segregation in schools, workplaces, restaurants, and all public facilities. For the first time, discrimination by race, color, or religion was a federal crime. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed it into law, he said, "We have come now to a time of testing. We must not fail." Across the country, bells of celebration rang. But in the South, those bells sounded like a threat. The ink on the Civil Rights Act was barely dry when new battles began, this time over the right to vote. In Selma, Alabama, a quiet town on the banks of the Alabama River, Black citizens made up nearly half the population, but only a handful were registered voters. Every attempt to register was met with intimidation, violence, or impossible tests. So, activists decided to challenge the system once again. Under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the SCLC, and local groups like the Dallas County Voters League, they planned a march from Selma to Montgomery, a 54-mile journey to demand the right to vote. On March 7, 1965, 600 marchers gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church. They prayed, locked arms, and began their walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. What awaited them on the other side was horror. As they reached the crest of the bridge, state troopers and sheriff's deputies stood in a line, blocking their path. The order was given: advance. Tear gas filled the air. Mounted officers charged. Men and women were trampled, beaten, and whipped. The pavement ran with blood. Television cameras captured every second. The brutality, the screams, the chaos. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. The images shocked the nation. Americans who had once been indifferent now demanded action. Churches filled with prayers. Students marched in solidarity. Even members of Congress wept as they watched the footage. King called for another march, this time under federal protection. 2 weeks later, he led thousands, black and white, rich and poor, across that same bridge. This time, the path stayed open. And when they reached Montgomery, King spoke to the crowd with words that would echo for generations. How long will it take? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Within months, President Johnson introduced new legislation to protect the right to vote. Standing before Congress, he spoke the words of the movement itself: "We shall overcome." On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. It outlawed literacy tests, authorized federal oversight of elections in racist states, and guaranteed every American the right to vote, regardless of color. The struggle that began in Montgomery a decade earlier had come full circle. The dream, spoken on the Mall, was no longer just a vision. It was written into the law of the land. But victory came at a cost. The years of struggle had left scars, both on the nation and on Martin Luther King himself. He was only 36 years old, yet his face carried the weight of centuries. He had seen progress and hatred side by side, triumph followed by tragedy. He knew the dream was alive, but fragile, because laws could change hearts slowly, and injustice had deep roots. Still, he refused to give up. Even in exhaustion, he kept marching, kept preaching, kept believing. And though his life would end just 3 years later, the movement he helped build would continue to shape the conscience of America. As the 1960s burned on, the movement's songs still echoed. "We shall overcome. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." Those voices, from the buses of Montgomery to the bridge in Selma, carried more than protest. They carried faith, faith that even in the darkest night, the dawn of justice was coming. And that faith became the foundation of a new America, one still imperfect, still struggling, but forever changed by the dream and the fire. The Civil Rights Act had outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act had restored democracy. But the work of freedom, the real work, was only beginning. Because equality written in ink means nothing without courage written in hearts. If you've walked this journey with us, through the courage of Rosa Parks, the songs of the Freedom Riders, the dream on the Mall, and the blood on the bridge, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our history series. The story of justice never ends, and neither should the telling of it. The year was 1965. America had just witnessed what many believed was the triumph of a lifetime. With the stroke of a pen, President Lyndon B. Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act, following the Civil Rights Act just a year earlier. The movement that began in Montgomery and marched through Selma seemed to have reached its mountaintop. The laws were finally on paper. Equality, at least in theory, was won. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The streets still hummed with anger. The promises made by Washington had yet to reach the neighborhoods of Harlem, Watts, and Chicago's South Side. The dream that had lifted millions was now colliding with the harsh weight of reality. They thought the dream was fulfilled, but in truth, the battle had only changed its shape. Because when hope meets disappointment, something else awakens. Rage. And that's where we begin. The moment the dream began to crack. The same year that King celebrated legislative victory, he stood before reporters in disbelief. "We may have won the right to vote," he said, "but we still have not won the right to live as men." In the shadows of progress, poverty, discrimination, and police brutality remained everyday realities. Then came Watts, Los Angeles, August 1965. What began as a simple traffic stop exploded into 6 days of chaos. Fires painted the sky orange, sirens howled, and over 30 people were killed. The message from the streets was clear. Laws could not erase generations of pain. The people were tired of waiting for freedom to trickle down. Dr. King, shocked by the violence, traveled to Watts. But he was met with jeers, not cheers. Young men told him that his dream was no longer theirs. They didn't want peace. They wanted power. For King, it was a haunting realization. Nonviolence was losing its audience. In those years, America was also changing. The Vietnam War was escalating, consuming lives and dividing the nation. King began speaking out, not just about civil rights, but about the immorality of war itself. In 1967, he delivered one of his most controversial speeches, Beyond Vietnam. He called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. The backlash was immediate. Newspapers turned on him. Politicians who once supported him fell silent. Even within the civil rights community, some feared he was going too far. But King would not stop. He saw poverty, racism, and war as 3 heads of the same monster. Meanwhile, other voices were rising. Voices that spoke a different language of resistance. Malcolm X had once warned that the ballot or the bullet would be America's choice. And though Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, his words had not died with him. They echoed in the hearts of a younger, angrier generation. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, began to shift direction. Leaders such as Stokely Carmichael started using a new phrase, Black Power. It was bold, defiant. It rejected the notion of asking for rights, and instead demanded them. By 1967, the summer heat once again ignited American cities. Detroit, Newark, and dozens of others burned. Tanks rolled down American streets. Soldiers patrolled neighborhoods that looked like war zones. President Johnson launched a national commission to find out why. Their conclusion was sobering. Our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The laws had changed, but the system had not. And when change moves too slowly, hope turns into something more dangerous. Desperation. Dr. King knew this storm was coming. In the final years of his life, he turned his focus to economic justice. He believed that civil rights without financial equality was an unfinished revolution. He began organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial movement to demand jobs, fair wages, and housing. But by now, many saw him as a dreamer out of time, a preacher in a nation that had lost its patience. Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation workers were striking for dignity. Men who carried signs that read, "I am a man." King went there to support them. It was April 3rd when he gave his final speech, the one history would never forget. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said. "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next evening, April 4th, 1968, 6:01 p.m. As he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, a single gunshot ended the life of Martin Luther King Jr. The news spread like wildfire. Across America, cities erupted. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, the skies turned black with smoke. To millions, it felt as if the heart of the nation had been torn out. But amid the sorrow, there was also a quiet determination. King had always said that the moral arc of the universe was long, but it bent toward justice. His followers clung to that hope, even when the world seemed to crumble around them. In those chaotic days, Robert Kennedy, running for president, delivered a brief but powerful message to a grieving crowd. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need is not hatred, but love and compassion toward one another. 2 months later, he too would fall to an assassin's bullet. The decade that had begun with dreams of freedom was ending in funerals. As the 1960s drew to a close, America stood at a crossroads. The dream had not died, but it had changed. It was no longer the dream of a single man standing at a podium in Washington. It had splintered into countless new visions, some peaceful, some militant, all searching for a way forward. The movement was entering a new age, one fueled not by hymns and handshakes, but by clenched fists and unbroken pride. Because when a dream is shattered, it doesn't disappear. It becomes something sharper, something that refuses to die quietly. If you've followed this journey from the marches to the mountaintop, don't stop here. The story is far from over. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of America's ongoing struggle for justice. The gun smoke of 1968 had barely settled when America looked around and realized the dreamers were gone. Malcolm X was dead. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. Robert Kennedy was dead. The voices that once called for peace were silenced one after another. And in their absence, a new sound began to rise. Not the hymns of church choirs, but the chant of the streets. Black power. It wasn't born in a church or on a ballot. It was born in the fire, the anger, and the pride of a generation that refused to wait any longer. This was not the movement of dreamers. It was the movement of doers, defenders, and revolutionaries. In the late 1960s, the spirit of the civil rights movement began to change its shape. The patience of the old guard met the urgency of youth. Dr. King's calls for love and forgiveness had inspired millions, but to many young Black Americans, love no longer seemed enough. They had seen too many funerals, too many broken promises, and too many policemen walk free. One of the first to channel this frustration was Stokely Carmichael, the fiery young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. During a 1966 march in Mississippi, after yet another brutal beating by police, Carmichael took the microphone and shouted words that electrified the crowd. "We want Black power!" It was a moment of rupture and rebirth. The movement was no longer just about integration. It was about identity, dignity, and control. The phrase Black power became both a rallying cry and a lightning rod. To the establishment, it sounded like rebellion. To millions of African Americans, it sounded like freedom. Across the country, a new generation embraced the idea that Black communities needed not charity, but self-determination. If the system would not protect them, they would protect themselves. If schools would not teach them their history, they would write it themselves. And if America would not love them, they would learn to love their Blackness. Out of this energy emerged one of the most iconic movements of the era, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, their image was striking: black leather jackets, berets, and raised fists. They patrolled neighborhoods with law books in one hand and rifles in the other, citing the very laws that the police used against them. But the Panthers were more than a symbol of militancy. They opened free breakfast programs, medical clinics, and education centers. They taught children that Black was beautiful, and powerful. The media often portrayed them as dangerous radicals, but to many communities, they were protectors and providers in a system that had forgotten them. The FBI, however, saw them as a threat. Under J. Edgar Hoover's secret program, COINTELPRO, the government launched a nationwide campaign to infiltrate, discredit, and destroy Black activist groups. Leaders were spied on, harassed, and in many cases, assassinated. In 1969, Chicago police raided the apartment of Fred Hampton, a charismatic 21-year-old leader of the Illinois Black Panthers. He was shot and killed in his sleep. The official story claimed self-defense, but evidence later revealed he was executed. To many, Fred Hampton became another martyr, a symbol that America feared not the gun, but the idea behind it. By now, the dream had evolved. It was no longer about sitting at the table, it was about building their own. The late 1960s and early 1970s were turbulent but transformative years. Black power reshaped art, fashion, and speech. The raised fist became a universal sign of resistance. Afros, once considered defiant, became symbols of pride. The words, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," from James Brown's hit song became a national anthem for a generation. The revolution was not just in the streets. It was in the schools, in the music, and in the mind. Universities began offering Black Studies programs, exploring African and African American history, long erased from textbooks. Writers like Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison gave voice to the struggle in words that the world could not ignore. Every poem, every painting, every note of soul and jazz became an act of defiance, a declaration that blackness was not a wound, but a source of power. At the same time, the movement's diversity also created tension. Some activists focused on political participation and local governance, while others sought revolution. Women, who had always been at the heart of the movement, began demanding recognition within it. Leaders like Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, and Elaine Brown challenged both racial and gender hierarchies. Davis, in particular, became an icon. A scholar, activist, and member of the Communist Party, she was arrested in 1970 on false charges and placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Her face became a symbol of both repression and resilience. When she was eventually acquitted, the cheers from around the world signaled something profound. The struggle for justice was now global. But for all its energy, the Black Power movement faced enormous challenges: internal divisions, government infiltration, and relentless state pressure began to fracture it from within. By the mid-1970s, many of its leaders were either dead, imprisoned, or in exile. Still, its impact could not be erased. The idea that Black people could define their own destiny, control their own image, and speak in their own voice had permanently altered America's landscape. And, though the slogans would change over time, from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, the heartbeat remained the same. In those years, America began to see what true transformation looked like. The power of a people no longer asking for a seat at the table, but building their own foundation brick by brick. From the rhythm of the drums to the pulse of the streets, from the classrooms to the microphones. The revolution had moved beyond protest. It had become culture. As the 1970s dawned, the roar of the streets began to fade into a new kind of expression: music, art, and politics. The next chapter of the struggle would not be fought with marches and megaphones, but with microphones and canvases. Because revolutions don't always die. Sometimes they just find a new rhythm. The revolution had shouted in the streets. It had faced bullets, arrests, and betrayal. But by the 1970s, the shouting began to fade. Not because the fire had died, but because it had found a new voice. The movement no longer marched. It sang. It danced. It painted. It spoke through rhythm and color. From the ashes of protest rose a new form of power: cultural power. This was the decade when revolution became art, and identity became an anthem. The 1970s opened with exhaustion. After years of marches, riots, and assassinations, the black community faced both progress and pain. Civil rights laws existed, but the promised equality felt distant. Unemployment was high, inner-city schools crumbled, and drugs began flooding the neighborhoods. And yet, amid all that hardship, something remarkable began to grow. A cultural renaissance. If America would not listen to their cries for justice, then it would have to hear their music. The sound came first, bold, soulful, and unafraid. Artists like Aretha Franklin, Curtis Mayfield, and Marvin Gaye turned pain into melody. Mayfield's People Get Ready became a hymn of hope. Gaye's What's Going On transformed sorrow into a soulful question America couldn't ignore. Every note carried a message. Every lyric was a protest wrapped in rhythm. Then came James Brown, shouting what would become a generation's declaration, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." It wasn't just a song. It was liberation pressed onto vinyl. The soul movement gave birth to funk, the sound of confidence, rhythm, and defiance. Bands like Earth, Wind and Fire, the Isley Brothers, and Sly and the Family Stone made music that celebrated black identity instead of mourning it. Where the 1960s had marched for rights, the 1970s danced for pride. Revolutions can burn down cities, but culture rebuilds them. The same transformation swept across fashion, film, and art. Afros became crowns of pride. Dashikis replaced suits. Black was no longer something to hide. It was something to celebrate. Hollywood, too, began to change. Movies like Shaft, Superfly, and Cleopatra Jones gave audiences black heroes who were bold, strong, and unapologetically powerful. Critics called it blaxploitation, but for many, it was the first time they saw themselves on screen, not as victims, but as protagonists. The camera lens had finally turned toward the black experience. Raw, real, and revolutionary. Beyond the glamour, politics also shifted. For the first time, black Americans began gaining visible power inside the system. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress, ran for president under the slogan, "Unbought and Unbossed." In cities across America, from Detroit to Atlanta, African Americans were elected mayors, shaping policies in communities that had once been silenced. This was a quiet revolution. Ballots replacing protests, boardrooms replacing barricades. The same movement that had once marched in Selma was now negotiating in city halls. But victory came with complexity. The visibility of a few could not erase the suffering of the many. The gap between the middle class and the poor within the black community widened. The system, once external, now lived within the very fabric of society. Harder to see, but just as powerful. While progress was being measured in laws and offices, another revolution was brewing in the streets: the birth of hip-hop. In the Bronx, New York, young black and Latino kids, ignored by the media, forgotten by the government, began expressing themselves with turntables, microphones, and spray paint. They didn't have record labels or instruments. They had their voices, their walls, and their rhythm. DJ Kool Herc threw the first block parties, looping beats that made crowds move for hours. Rappers began rhyming about the realities of the streets: poverty, police, pride. Graffiti became art. Breakdancing became performance, and rap became truth. What began as noise in neglected neighborhoods soon became a global movement. Hip-hop didn't ask for permission. It spoke directly from the pavement. Raw, unfiltered, and real. It was the sound of survival and the sound of the future. Meanwhile, literature and art continued to tell the deeper story. Writers like Maya Angelou with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and Toni Morrison with The Bluest Eye brought the emotional core of the Black experience into the homes of millions. Pain, love, memory, identity. Their words became scripture for a people still finding their place in America's story. Painters like Jacob Lawrence and Faith Ringgold turned history into color, celebrating Black resilience on canvas. The movement that began with speeches now lived in every medium, every song, every brushstroke, every page. Through it all, one truth remained constant. The struggle had evolved, but it had not ended. Racism was no longer written on signs, it was hidden in systems. Segregation no longer needed walls. It survived in poverty lines and school zones. The dream of equality had moved from the courtroom to the classroom, from the protest line to the recording studio. The voices had changed, but the message was the same. We are here, and we will not be erased. As the decade closed, the nation stood on the edge of another transformation. The optimism of the 1960s had turned into realism, and sometimes cynicism, but beneath it all, the movement had left something indestructible. A generation proud of its skin, aware of its history, and unwilling to let go of its identity. The drums of the 1960s had faded. The fires of the 1970s cooled to embers. And as the 1980s dawned, America stood at a crossroads. One foot in the dream of equality, the other in the shadow of what that dream had failed to deliver. The movement had changed laws, hearts, and history itself. But even as one chapter closed, a question remained. Had America truly kept its promise, or had the dream been rewritten by time, politics, and power? This is the story of what came after the dream, the long shadow that still stretches across the nation today. In the years following the marches and the music, the civil rights movement had left behind undeniable victories. Voting rights were enshrined in law. Segregation was outlawed. Black voices filled classrooms, city halls, and television screens. The dream of equality had moved from the margins into the mainstream. But the road ahead was uneven, because while the signs of whites only disappeared, new barriers quietly took their place. The 1980s brought a different kind of war, not fought in the streets, but in policies and priorities. Under President Ronald Reagan, the country shifted toward conservatism. Taxes were cut, social programs were slashed, and the language of law and order replaced that of justice and equality. In inner cities, poverty deepened, schools crumbled, jobs vanished, and drugs flooded entire communities. The crack epidemic tore families apart, and the government's answer was the war on drugs, a campaign that would fill America's prisons for decades to come. By the end of the 1980s, African Americans made up nearly half of the nation's prison population, despite being a small fraction of its people. It wasn't just crime being punished, it was a cycle of poverty being criminalized. The dream had won the law, but the law had found new ways to shape the dream. Still, hope refused to die. The spirit of the movement lived on, reshaped, redefined, reborn. Civil rights leaders like Jesse Jackson carried the torch into the political arena. His Rainbow Coalition united working-class Americans of every color, echoing King's vision of economic justice. His message was clear: keep hope alive. And hope did live on. In classrooms, in pulpits, in microphones, a new generation of artists, teachers, and activists took the old message and remixed it for a new age. The marches had ended, but the movement had not. It had simply changed its rhythm. Music, once again, became the language of resistance. Hip-hop, born in the Bronx during the 1970s, had now exploded into a national voice. Groups like Public Enemy, NWA, and Run DMC used their lyrics to tell Stories that politicians ignored. Don't believe thee. Hype. Fight the power. Straight. Outta Compton. These weren't just songs. They were battle cries set to a beat. Through rap, young Black Americans reclaimed their narrative, turning anger into art and oppression into expression. The microphone became the new megaphone of protest. Meanwhile, on screens and stages, representation grew stronger. Shows like The Cosby Show and A Different World offered images of educated, successful Black families, countering decades of stereotypes. Filmmakers like Spike Lee turned cinema into commentary, reminding audiences that racism was not history, but a living reality. His 1989 film, Do the Right Thing, forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about race, anger, and identity. The fight for equality was no longer just about marches or legislation. It was about how America saw itself and how it wanted to be seen. Yet, even with progress in culture and politics, the pain persisted. The names of the fallen changed, but the reasons often did not. Rodney King, beaten by police in 1991, became a symbol of the ongoing struggle against racial injustice. The riots that followed in Los Angeles echoed the flames of Watts decades earlier. Time had passed, but history's rhythm had not. The same questions from 1968 still haunted America. How long must justice wait? And how many times must the dream be reborn? As the decades rolled on, the legacy of the civil rights movement continued to ripple outward. New generations drew inspiration from the past. From Rosa Parks' quiet defiance to Malcolm's fierce independence. From King's dream to Angela Davis's courage. The movement's children became its teachers. And though the struggle evolved, from voter suppression to police reform, from housing discrimination to mass incarceration, the heartbeat remained the same. Because the story of America's civil rights is not a tale of the past. It's a mirror showing us who we were, who we are, and who we still need to become. Dr. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." That arc did not end in 1968. It stretches through every protest sign, every song, every voice that refuses to be silent. From the streets of Selma to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, from the classrooms of the 1980s to the marches of today, the dream lives on, carried by those who refuse to let it fade, because the dream was never just his. It was always ours. If this journey moved you, from the hope of the marches to the battles that still echo today, don't let it end here. Subscribe now to watch more powerful history videos like this one. Stories of struggle, courage, and the people who shape the world we live in. Together, we'll keep history alive.